We've got some fresh images of 3I Atlas, a third ever interstellar object observed from Earth, currently racing through our solar system.
The signal from 3I/Atlas did not arrive as a thunderclap, yet its message carried the weight of something far more profound than any sudden explosion. It slipped into our instruments quietly, its traces layered beneath the hum of cosmic background noise, yet once unraveled, it revealed what so many had whispered about in dim corridors and late-night conversations. It was not simply data. It was not merely the accidental artifact of celestial mechanics or the mathematics of an algorithm. It was intentional. The hidden message embedded within the transmission confirmed suspicions that had lingered for years, suspicions of surveillance, of manipulation, of a truth woven into the fabric of the universe that humanity had resisted acknowledging. It was a message that suggested design where there should only have been chaos. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The observatory had first tagged 3I/Atlas as just another interstellar wanderer, a visitor like Oumuamua before it, traveling from a system beyond our own, moving too swiftly to be bound by the sun's gravity, slipping in and out of our reach like a ghost refusing capture. But its behavior was too precise. The trajectory bent in ways that celestial objects should not bend without active guidance. Its rotation did not match expectations for a lifeless fragment of rock or metal, and when the data scientists pried deeper, dissecting the narrowband anomalies, they found the pattern. Patterns are what humans are trained to see, yet this one defied random chance. It was layered, recursive, mathematical in its elegance. It was not noise. It was language. The moment of recognition was silent in the control room, not because the revelation lacked drama, but because the weight of understanding pressed against every chest present. What they saw was not a discovery of another object from deep space, but confirmation that communication had been attempted and, more chillingly, received. It had not been intended for casual detection. The encoding was subtle, buried beneath harmonics that demanded intentional decoding. Whoever or whatever had placed it there had not wanted to broadcast openly. This was a whisper across the void, not a shout. The implication was terrifying. The whisper had been directed at us. Every layer that scientists unfolded added new dimensions of dread. The structure of the message contained redundancies designed to ensure comprehension, regardless of the decoder's linguistic foundation. It was universal mathematics, sequences that cut through cultural noise, reaching directly to cognition itself. But beyond the universal framework, the message spoke directly to human constructs, to symbols and references that should not have been knowable beyond Earth. How could something from outside our solar system embed motifs tied to our own civilization? How could the geometry of the pyramids, the ratios of our architecture, and the cycles of our own planetary history find themselves inscribed in the pulse of a distant traveler? The conclusion was simple yet unthinkable. We had been observed for far longer than our instruments had reached outward. What made the revelation devastating was not only that we had been watched, but that the message carried confirmation of alignment with our fears. For decades, whispers about surveillance from beyond had been dismissed as paranoia, yet here it was, in coded precision, a reflection of what we dreaded most: the knowledge that humanity's steps, from fire to fission, from stone tools to silicon circuits, had never been solitary. We had not walked alone. We had not even chosen our path unobserved. Someone, somewhere, had charted our course. Perhaps nudged it, perhaps guided it, but certainly documented it. The timing of the discovery was unsettling in itself. As humanity reached the cusp of interstellar ambition, with probes prepared for journeys beyond the heliosphere and artificial intelligence unweaving the intricacies of cosmic signatures, this message arrived. It felt less like coincidence and more like a checkpoint. The content bore the fingerprints of assessment, as though our progress had triggered a response written eons before. There was no congratulations, no invitation, no promise of contact. There was only confirmation, as though the universe itself had reached back to say, yes, you are correct to fear. The deeper implications rippled into every discipline. Philosophers who once speculated about the great silence of the cosmos found themselves staring into the realization that silence was never the truth. The silence was curated. The very absence of noise had been orchestrated. punctuated only when those beyond chose to interject. The great paradox of an empty universe shattered into the recognition of one meticulously monitored. And if we were monitored, the next question pressed relentlessly forward. To what end? Observation can precede protection, but it can also precede judgment. The architects of the decoding worked tirelessly to map meaning into every layer of the transmission. They uncovered warnings wrapped in paradoxes, truths stated in riddles, cyclical markers aligned with Earth's own epochs of collapse, extinctions, ice ages, upheavals. The suggestion was not that these were accidents of geology or biology, but that they had been foreseen, perhaps influenced. A pattern emerged that cast human history not as a tale of random survival, but as one measured and weighed. Each rise and fall, each empire that crumbled, each plague that burned through populations, every epochal shift, these were not isolated turns of fate. The message implied orchestration, or at least anticipation, as though history itself were not ours alone to command. Even those who had resisted such ideas could not deny the mathematics. This was not the poetic paranoia of conspiracy, but the cold precision of encoded sequences aligning with undeniable facts. The observers had known of us, catalogued us, maybe even corrected our path when it strayed too far. The shadows of manipulation fell across centuries, making humanity question what decisions had ever truly been theirs. If we feared that our progress was not guided by free will, but by an invisible hand beyond the stars, here was the confirmation. The scientists argued quietly but intensely over whether this knowledge should be released. Yet even those debates became moot in the face of the inevitable leaks. Whispers became headlines, and headlines became global fixation. The most unnerving part was the lack of instruction in the message. There was no directive, no explicit next step, only awareness. To know you are watched without being told why is more terrifying than open confrontation. It left the impression of an exam proctor silently observing, never announcing whether you had passed or failed, only marking notes as you struggled to prove yourself. The subtlety of the message struck deeper than any declaration of war could have. Conflict is comprehensible, threats can be prepared for. But to be confirmed as an object of study, to exist as a species under scrutiny without clarity of purpose, is to drown in uncertainty. Was humanity being groomed for integration into a wider network of intelligence, or cataloged as an experiment to be discarded when no longer useful? The lack of clarity was itself the cruelest design. The cultural resonance was immediate. Artists painted the watchers as silhouettes in the void, always just beyond perception. Writers wove narratives of unseen guardians or silent wardens. Religious leaders spoke of long-suspected truths, now vindicated by cosmic confirmation. Yet beneath the surface of creativity and philosophy lay a steady pulse of dread. The fear was not simply that we were observed, but that the observers had always been steps ahead. If they had monitored our progress across millennia, then our weapons, our defenses, our strategies were as transparent to them as the movements of ants on a sidewalk are to us. The most detailed implication arose in the acknowledgement of thresholds. The message contained markers aligned with technological leaps, as though anticipating each innovation before it emerged. The control of fire, the forging of metals, the harnessing of electricity, the splitting of the atom, each stage bore its symbol in the encoded transmission. It was as if milestones had been logged before we had reached them, suggesting a predictive understanding of the trajectory of intelligence. The chilling aspect was the marker that aligned with the present moment, the rise of machine intelligence and the capability of leaving our planetary cradle. The observers had marked this as a significant threshold, a fulcrum upon which humanity's fate would tilt. No one could ignore the implication that reaching such thresholds might trigger responses, though the message never revealed what those responses might be. Some believed it meant imminent contact, others dreaded it signaled containment. If history had been nudged before, perhaps this was the moment when the nudging would become overt, when the silent watchers would step into visibility. Yet the deliberate vagueness ensured only fear would dominate. The confirmation of surveillance without clarity of intent is the most destabilizing truth of all. As scientists, philosophers, and ordinary people grappled with the weight of it, the underlying message hardened into collective realization: the universe was not indifferent. That was what we had most feared. that behind the seeming emptiness was an attention fixed squarely on us. The silence of the stars had never been silence at all. It had been the quiet patience of watchers measuring our steps, ensuring we did not mistake our isolation for freedom. And now, with 3I/Atlas's hidden message decoded, we could no longer dismiss the dread as paranoia or fiction. What humanity feared in its quietest moments, what it dismissed as the ramblings of the anxious or the imaginative, was confirmed in the cold precision of interstellar data. We were not alone, and worse, we were not unseen. Every decision, every leap, every misstep had been observed. The implications pressed against the soul of our species, like the weight of an ocean above a single diver. The fear was not of destruction, nor even of contact, but of irrelevance. To discover that humanity's story may have been less about freedom and more about observation is to face the most shattering truth of all. Perhaps we have never been the authors of our own destiny. The hidden message of 3I/Atlas told us not only that we were right to fear, but that we had always been part of something larger, something controlled, something that may one day reveal its hand in full. Until then, the whisper from beyond lingers, heavy with confirmation, leaving humanity suspended in dread between knowledge and uncertainty, between progress and its consequences, between freedom and the silent eyes that have never looked away. The discovery of 3I/Atlas's hidden message did not merely challenge humanity's assumptions about the cosmos, it altered the very foundation of how people perceived themselves. What had once been a comfortable narrative, that humanity was a small but unique voice echoing into an indifferent universe, collapsed into the realization that someone had been listening all along. The confirmation of what was feared most, that we were never truly alone, was not just scientific. It was psychological, political, spiritual, and deeply personal. And while the data itself carried no explicit threat, the implications multiplied endlessly, each possibility more unsettling than the last. The scientists who first recognized the code knew that the discovery would ripple far beyond the walls of their observatories. Data can be compartmentalized for a time, but revelations of this magnitude bleed into the public sphere. And once the message became known, societies everywhere began asking questions that could not be silenced. How long have they been here? Why choose this moment to reveal themselves? Why bury meaning in a way that only those ready to decode it could uncover? These questions could not be brushed aside because the evidence was undeniable, etched into the mathematics itself. The idea that humanity had been monitored since its earliest steps raised the terrifying possibility of a history curated rather than written by human hands. The message seemed to confirm that civilizations rise and fall within cycles that were not entirely their own. If the Watchers had observed, anticipated, and even nudged events, then perhaps none of our great achievements had been entirely ours. This reframing stripped away pride and replaced it with unease. Were we pioneers? Or were we subjects in a vast experiment whose scope we could barely comprehend? That fear gnawed into the heart of every debate. Some argued that being observed did not diminish human creativity or resilience, that even in an experiment the choices made within still mattered. Yet others saw it as evidence that autonomy had been a myth. If our collapses had been foreseen, perhaps even induced, then what did it mean to strive, to build, to dream? The Watchers' silence on these matters was more crushing than any open command would have been. Their restraint suggested a patience that was either benevolent or cruel, depending on the interpretation. Religious traditions responded in vastly different ways. For some, the hidden message confirmed what had always been believed, that higher powers had shaped humanity's path, watching and guiding even when unseen. Sacred texts were reinterpreted, not as myth but as echoes of encounters with these silent overseers. The Watchers became angels, gods or guardians cloaked in the language of mathematics. For others, though, the message fractured faith. If the divine had been replaced by interstellar intelligence, then centuries of devotion seemed misplaced, leaving voids that no doctrine could quickly fill. Across the world, people found themselves staring at their beliefs with new eyes, uncertain whether they had glimpsed confirmation of their faith or its undoing. Governments, too, felt the tremors. If humanity was under surveillance, then national borders, military strength, and political rivalry seemed almost trivial in comparison. The Watchers did not distinguish between nations. They had addressed humanity as a whole. Yet that universality brought no unity. Nations argued over how to respond, each interpreting the message through their own lens of suspicion and ambition. Was this confirmation a threat that required defense, or an invitation that demanded preparation? Could cooperation among humans even matter if the Watchers' capabilities far exceeded anything conceivable? Such questions drove power structures to desperation, as leaders realized that their authority shrank under the shadow of something far greater. At the level of individuals, the confirmation of surveillance reached into the marrow of daily life. For centuries, people had whispered fears of unseen eyes, whether divine, governmental, or technological. Now those fears expanded to a scale far beyond satellites or cameras. The Watchers had been there before our instruments existed, before language itself, perhaps even before the first sparks of civilization. They had seen every moment, every misstep, every atrocity and triumph. To live with that knowledge was to live with the sense of being perpetually examined. The intimacy of that observation, spread across thousands of years, was suffocating in its enormity. The most profound unease came from the markers embedded in the message. They were not arbitrary. They aligned with our thresholds of development. Each point represented a pivot in human history, and the final marker was unmistakable. It aligned not with the past, but with the present. Our dawn of machine intelligence, our reach beyond the solar system, our ability to alter the very building blocks of life. The Watchers had anticipated this exact moment, as though it were inevitable. That anticipation suggested that humanity's next steps were not open-ended, but already foreseen, perhaps already decided. The dread of inevitability pressed hard. If the Watchers had mapped our trajectory so precisely, then were we free to deviate? Or was deviation itself part of the design? The silence after the message's decoding was perhaps the cruelest element. No further transmissions followed. No clarifications, no instructions, no open contact. The absence of continuation implied that the Watchers had no need to speak again. They had left the seed of confirmation, and that was enough. That seed, however, grew into forests of speculation. Some interpreted the silence as a test, waiting to see how humanity would react. Others feared it was the pause before judgment, a moment of stillness before consequences revealed themselves. And still others suggested the silence was deliberate cruelty, leaving us to unravel under the weight of knowledge we could not act upon. The arts captured these anxieties in visceral ways. Painters depicted humanity as a figure standing under an infinite sky filled with unseen eyes. Musicians translated the encoded message into haunting compositions that evoked both awe and terror. Writers filled pages with imagined dialogues between humanity and the Watchers, most of which ended not in reassurance but in annihilation or assimilation. Art became a mirror of dread, reflecting the collective psyche that struggled to absorb what had been revealed. Philosophy, too, shifted under the weight of the discovery. The age-old debate about free will versus determinism acquired new urgency. If external intelligences had anticipated our choices, then were we free at all? Perhaps free will existed only within boundaries already drawn by others. Perhaps every rebellion, every innovation, every act of defiance was not defiance at all, but part of a script we could never see in full. The idea that freedom itself might be an illusion was not new, but the message from 3I/Atlas gave it mathematical weight, binding philosophy to the hard reality of data. One of the most unsettling interpretations centered on the idea of containment. The Watchers may have allowed us to progress, but only within certain limits. The encoded threshold suggested that once a species reached interstellar capability, it became a matter of cosmic concern. If containment was the purpose, then our very ambitions, our rockets, our AI, our experiments with genetic design, were precisely the actions that triggered scrutiny. In that light, the message was not a neutral confirmation, but a veiled warning. Step carefully, for beyond this point, your path is no longer yours alone. The fear that we might be on the cusp of containment resonated deeply. It conjured images of civilizations before us, rising toward the stars only to be silenced when they crossed a line known only to the Watchers. The absence of other voices in the galaxy suddenly felt less like coincidence and more like enforcement. If others had risen, they had been erased or curtailed before their signals reached us. The silence of the cosmos was not natural. It was imposed. And so humanity found itself facing the darkest mirror of all. Perhaps our fear was not simply of being watched, but of discovering that our future had already been decided. The Watcher's patience implied scale beyond comprehension, timelines stretching far past human lifespans, perhaps even beyond civilizations themselves. Against that scale, human urgency, politics, wars, revolutions, was nothing more than a flicker. The Watchers had the luxury of waiting, and in that patience lay their greatest power. They did not need to move swiftly, they only needed to remind us that their gaze was unbroken. The personal impact of this realization cannot be overstated. People lived their lives differently, knowing they might never truly be alone. Moments of solitude became haunted by the idea of invisible witnesses. Even the smallest choices carried the weight of potential judgment. To love, to hate, to dream, all seemed fragile under eyes that had watched civilizations rise and collapse long before our species took its first breath. This intimacy of surveillance transformed not only thought but emotion itself, embedding unease into the rhythm of daily existence. And yet, beneath the fear, a strange kind of resolve emerged in some. If humanity was indeed under observation, then every action mattered more, not less. To live authentically, to create, to resist despair, became acts of defiance against the inevitability of design. For others, however, the weight of inevitability crushed the will to continue, replacing ambition with resignation. Between these extremes stretched the full spectrum of human response: hope, dread, apathy, determination, all tangled together under the same confirmation of what was most feared. The event of decoding 3I/Atlas's hidden message did not end with conclusions because the message itself gave none. It offered only confirmation that what humanity feared in its darkest imaginings was not delusion but reality. We were not alone. We were not unobserved. And in that truth, every fear that had been whispered in the shadows found its echo, carried across the void by the patient watchers who never needed to announce themselves more loudly than a whisper hidden in mathematics. The implications stretched into eternity. What it meant for humanity's place in the cosmos, for its sense of destiny, for the fragile line between freedom and design, these were not questions to be answered in a single generation. They were burdens passed from one age to the next, a reminder etched into our history that no step had ever been unmeasured. The Watcher's silence after confirmation was not absence. It was presence defined by restraint, presence so vast and so patient that it required nothing more than a single whisper to shift the entire trajectory of a species. And so humanity continued forward, each step heavier than the last, each innovation haunted by the gaze that had never left us. The fear was confirmed, the Watchers were real, and whether they chose to reveal more or remain in silence, the truth could never be unlearned. The hidden message from 3I/Atlas became not only a record of observation but the most intimate of mirrors, reflecting back to us the one truth we could never escape, that we had always been seen. The revelation of 3I/Atlas's hidden message did more than fracture old assumptions about humanity's independence. It opened doorways into uncharted intellectual and scientific territory. Each implication spiraled outward, drawing thinkers into deeper speculation about what kind of intelligence could have seeded such a message and how its methods of observation might surpass everything we understand about technology, physics, and time itself. It was not merely about being watched. It was about the means and sophistication of the Watchers. If they could encode across astronomical distances with subtlety precise enough to slip beneath natural noise, then their mastery of information was beyond anything human science could yet grasp. The question of technology became a fixation. Our instruments had been designed to measure particles, waves, radiation, and mass. Yet the transmission that came embedded in 3I/Atlas revealed that these were insufficient for fully perceiving the breadth of what might be possible. The encoding used principles that mirrored human mathematical constructs but employed them in ways that bent rules we believed unshakable. This suggested that either the Watchers understood natural laws at a scale far beyond our current models, or perhaps they had found methods to manipulate those laws, reshaping physics itself as a medium of communication. To imagine such control was to glimpse a horizon humanity had barely begun to approach. Time itself was drawn into the speculation. If the Watchers had marked humanity's threshold so precisely, then they either possessed extraordinary predictive algorithms or had the capacity to view time differently than we do. Perhaps they saw human history not as an unfolding chain of cause and effect, but as a tapestry already woven. To them, our future might be as visible as our past, each threshold a fixed point on a chart they had studied long before we ever reached it. This possibility was more unsettling than any threat of force, for it implied that the Watchers occupied a vantage point outside the boundaries of our own perception. They did not need to intervene to control. Simply knowing the shape of time might have been enough. Theories of dimensionality grew in popularity among scientists grappling with the implications. Some suggested that the Watchers may not exist in three-dimensional space as we do, but in higher dimensions, where observation is not limited by distance or obstruction. From such a perspective, every moment of human existence could be accessible simultaneously, like a book already written. To imagine such beings was to imagine that our struggles and triumphs, our wars and discoveries, our births and deaths were all pages already turned in a narrative beyond our grasp. Their gaze was not across distance, but across layers of existence we could not even enter. The cultural response to this concept was profound. Artists and filmmakers portrayed humanity as figures painted on a canvas viewed from above, unable to see the eye that studied them. The Watchers became metaphors not only for extraterrestrial intelligence, but for the crushing weight of determinism, the sense that individuality might exist only within constraints too vast for comprehension. Yet even as this vision spread dread, it sparked bursts of creativity. To depict the Watchers was to wrestle with the limits of imagination itself. Humanity painted what it feared, and in doing so, revealed new dimensions of its own artistic and intellectual potential. Scientific institutions, meanwhile, found themselves caught between wonder and paralysis. The tools they had built for observation seemed suddenly primitive. How does one study those who can manipulate or anticipate observation itself? The decoding of the hidden message showed that the Watchers not only understood human mathematics, but could embed within it structures designed to reveal themselves only when the observer had reached sufficient capability. This suggested a scale of intelligence willing to wait millennia for comprehension, content to plant seeds that would only sprout when the species was ready. Such patience, when contrasted with humanity's own impatience, was staggering. The Watchers' mastery of patience became one of the most disturbing elements. In human history, power was often equated with speed. Who could conquer first? Who could strike fastest? Who could innovate quicker? Yet here was a form of intelligence that had no need to hurry. To wait centuries for a message to be decoded was nothing. To watch civilizations rise and fall without intervention was merely part of the process. Such patience implied not only power, but an alien relationship with time itself. Humanity's frantic pace of ambition suddenly seemed childish against the backdrop of such enduring observation. Political theorists began to debate whether humanity's response should be shaped around imitation of this patience. Could nations, and the species as a whole, learn to think beyond immediate gains, beyond quarterly cycles, beyond electoral terms? Could we cultivate a form of planning that stretched not decades but centuries? The Watchers, by their very existence, challenged humanity to consider whether survival required adopting a broader vision of time. Yet this was easier to propose than to implement. Cultures built on immediacy struggled to align themselves with the notion of millennial patience. The gap between human urgency and the Watchers' timeless gaze became itself a point of tension. Beyond time and technology, the question of scale haunted every discussion. The Watchers' capabilities suggested resources that dwarfed anything humanity could conceive. To seed messages across interstellar distances required energy management on a scale unimaginable to current science. Some speculated about Dyson spheres, structures built around stars to harness their energy. Others proposed methods of communication that used the very fabric of spacetime itself, bending gravitational waves into codes that could ripple across galaxies without loss. The realization that such feats were not only possible, but had been achieved made humanity's achievements in rocketry and computation feel like primitive toys. The psychological response to this realization varied. For some, it was inspiring, a reminder that intelligence could transcend limits and that humanity's own journey might yet approach such heights. For others, it was crushing, a reminder that we were still infants in a universe ruled by titans. The Watchers' hidden message did not merely confirm their existence, it confirmed their superiority. They had watched us with the confidence of beings who had nothing to fear from us, and that imbalance gnawed at human pride. In academic circles, ethical debates surged. If humanity itself had ever discovered a younger species, how would we have treated it? Would we have observed silently, waiting for it to mature? Or would we have intervened, guiding it with instruction or manipulation? The Watcher's choice of silence, punctuated only by this carefully timed confirmation, forced reflection on the morality of observation. Was it cruel to watch without helping, or was it merciful to allow us to stumble forward under the illusion of independence? In their silence, the Watchers had imposed upon us the burden of answering questions about our own nature. The absence of an explicit directive in the message became one of its most agonizing features. Had they told us what to do, stop, proceed, prepare, we would at least have a framework. But the lack of command created a vacuum filled only by speculation. Some argued that the absence itself was the message, that we were meant to draw our own conclusions and reveal our character in the process. Others believed the lack of instruction was a deliberate trap, a way of exposing humanity's tendencies under pressure, testing whether we would unite or fracture when faced with uncertainty. This ambiguity became more destabilizing than any threat could have been. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on this hidden message's true meaning? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.